We are really grateful tonight to have some folks who were part of developing the resources that you'll be using, the Season of Creation and Pentecost 2 resources. Tim Johnson from Minneapolis and Rebecca Collins Jordan, who you heard from earlier, from New York City. You can read more about them in the development community's information in your resources. It's on page 8 and 9. But you also learn a little bit more than a little bit more about them as I introduce them to you and we start to talk a little bit. One of the questions I remembered from one of the development events as we were thinking about this event, we usually ask at development events, what is the significance of this scripture in our time and context? And those words seem to hold a lot of extra meaning right now as we come into using these resources that were developed pre-pandemic. So I want to do a quick check-in. Tim, I think that you joined the call and you're on deck first. So I want to make sure. Okay, great. Hi, Tim.
Howdy.
So your experience as a pastor has included working with congregations and many church organizations on issues of racial justice. And in these times of urgent calls for racial justice and reform within our institutions, I wondered if you could share one or two specific ways faith communities can, as you wrote in the development materials, introduction for this season, in these current times, draw on God's spirit of liberation to overcome oppression that they see in their communities.
Gladly. Thank you for the invitation. I just went back and actually looked at the text that we reflected on in terms of, the question that you're asking. And there's some good material right there. I actually find good material pretty much anytime I open up the lectionary. And that's because my firm belief is that the text is best read from an anti-imperial perspective, because I think, whatever text we're reading, the Hebrew scriptures, the New Testament, they're all written in imperial times, and I don't think we can truly fully understand them without putting them in that kind of a context. And so on some level, they are always speaking in response to and often in resistance to imperialism. So that's my starting point. And so it's not hard for me to find the connection between then and now, because I always believe that we should be rooting our interpretation of scripture in the now, but also in the context in which it was written. Mm-hmm. And so when I look at those texts, a couple of them just jumped out at me right away. The text that where Moses is engaged with dialogue with God and calling upon God's goodness and mercy and to stay with the people and not to give up on them, is in my sense is a continuation of the identity formation of the people of Israel as an anti-imperial, and I would add today with our current context, anti-imperial would include anti-racist, pro-justice, liberating community. I would put all those words in there because I see, when I look at that text, that's what it is about. Those early texts are about the formation of community and identity. So if I were to pull out from that a charge for communities in our time, looking at whether it be environmental justice or racial justice or any form of justice, that these texts are full of life for us, and they're calling us to be taking a look at our own identities as community of faith. Are we truly rooted in an anti-imperial resistance theology, and is that our identity as a community of faith? And if it is, that really informs the direction we are, informs our mission and our ministry. So that's, for me, actually, that's like place one. to be able to name clearly for ourselves and for our people an anti-imperial, anti-racist, pro-care for the earth congregation, which I believe flows firmly out of the Hebrew text and actually the Gospels and all of the Christian texts as well. And it's interesting in those texts that the scripture, is very open about the difficulty of holding on to that, because it begins with the people of Israel falling back into wanting to be drawn back into that Egyptian imperial captivity. It's a strong pull, it's a strong allure. So our theology needs to be mindful that this is not an easy calling. The second thing is then, of course, identity would be the first. The second would be, response, action. How do we live? How do we live this out? And, again, looking at the text that we were charged with, again, it isn't hard to find a direction for that. One of the lessons was about the brides with the lamps that some left and some, didn't have the sufficient oil because they weren't prepared. To me, that is about living in the now, being connected with the present, being ready to respond. It means, and if I think of it in terms of anti-racism, which is front and center for many of us, and as folks know, Minneapolis, St. Paul, which is actually where I'm from, is where George Floyd and all of the current racial justice concerns began to reemerge. So racial justice is at the center of that. And what does being prepared mean? Well, it means, among other things, if you want to be a serious anti-racist worker for justice, you can't just go out and start doing stuff without being informed, educating yourself, understanding deeply how racism is at work in our country, white supremacy, colonialism, all these big words, how they've been steeped in our history, our culture, our very being. And being prepared means engaging with that. And if we don't engage with that, we're not prepared. And if we're not prepared, we miss the moment when the opportunity is there for the bridegroom to come back, and using that metaphor. In the same way as another gospel text used in that section, is the text of when did I see you? When Jesus asks that question about the hungry and the poor and those in jail. And what is that about? But it's about being present. It's about being present with those who are facing these struggles. And so then it invites the question, where are we to be present in our own communities? It's not enough just to be kind of stepping back and looking at things from a distance or making policy statements, but where do we get called to be engaged? So I guess, in sum, it's those two things that I would offer up as places where communities of faith need to engage: identity and then action. So I'll let it go at that.
Tim, thank you. That's wonderful. And I think that's a great reminder to all of us to really take a closer look and think about the lens through which we're reading the scriptures for these seasons. And also, as you talked about, the identity piece and then the action piece, and identifying too, like the context that we're in, history and present, and then seeing where we need to be present in our own communities. That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Rebecca, it's so good to see you again. I haven't seen you since we were together in New York, but we were in New York City together. Yeah, we were in New York City for the development event. And you brought just a really rich background of environmental studies and reading scripture through the lens of environmental justice, which is one of the reasons I was so excited you got to brainstorm Seasons of Creation with us. And I wonder if you would just say what you would say to churches who are now looking at the season of creation through the lens of COVID-19 and the ongoing concerns of climate change.
Thank you, Barbara. I really was excited that we got the chance to do Seasons of Creation last year because it's very near to my heart. And I have been thinking a lot about our planet's environmental woes lately. And what stood out to me is that I think in a very unique and painful way, this human pandemic is very one with the Earth's pandemic. You know, we're living through the Earth's great disease, and it's caused by human hands. Seasons of the Spirit has always been a process of learning how Scripture reveals our times and finding connections between disparate or seemingly disparate events, both in the joys and the tragedies. And I think COVID and climate change are the same. I think if we were around that table writing this year, our conversation would be weaving those two narratives together. I think on the flip side of both of these great sicknesses is a quest for healing and restoration, as well as for creative connection with our neighbors, both neighbors who are humans, who are distanced from us right now, and neighbors in the non-human community from whom we have long suffered disconnection. And another bond between the two is grief. I think so often the key to restoration, to renewal, is listening to the pain. And the earth has a lot to teach about that. All around us, as this virus rages and scientists race for a vaccine, the whole earth system is struggling as well to plug in ecological gaps and to find ways to adapt to a rapidly shifting climate. And in many ways, it's succeeding as we're staying home. I recently read an article in the New York Times, maybe some of you read it as well, about the process of renewal of the gigantic Fishkills dump on Staten Island. This is near where I live. To restore it, landscape architects didn't do much for many years. They simply planted some native seeds and let it sit for a couple decades. And they operated with immense faith in the earth, without any expectation of developing or working the land in ways that they had that had created this dump. And now the trash is nearly covered over, and the place abounds with ecological diversity and peace. And it will soon become a quiet and remote city park, which is really a miracle in the city that never sleeps. And so in this time of immense loss and uncertainty, there is so much to mourn. I think that right now, Paul's words in the 8th chapter of the letter to the Romans, which are in the materials this season, are very easy to hear. It's easy, kind of very sadly easy for us to hear that all creation is groaning in the labor pains of hope for new life. And in the morning, there is that still small voice, the same one that speaks to psalmists who remember that their home is in God, that God is with them on this injured earth. And during this season of creation, I think leaning into both mourning and joy is in order as we encounter Scripture together. And the more you look in Scripture, and specifically in the Scripture texts from the season of creation that we have chosen, the more you see this older connection that many of the writers really did have to the earth in the midst of their own trauma during the Babylonian captivity, during those storied wanderings in the wilderness, the tyranny in Egypt. You see the natural motifs, the burning bush, Mount Sinai, the wanderings through the desert. These occupy their kind of spiritual landscapes and their real landscapes as well. And all of these natural motifs and non-human figures arise, and they evoke this awe and connection and joy and comfort in the midst of crisis. The earth has always been a partner in human suffering and joy. And just as much as we must relearn to be the same for the earth. So I really think my final thought is just that this is a perfect time to contemplate Earth's solidarity with us and ours with the Earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's great. I always appreciated in our time together bringing just this really voice for the earth and environmental justice. And I think in this time too, it's helpful to connect the two crises we're facing, and also, as you said, like lifting up the mourning and the joy, which will be something that will be helpful, I think, as people plan for worship and coming together and nurturing our faith. And important to remember and to lift both of those up.